So why am I starting a video series about the 1950s? Well, that's a very good question. I'm well aware that I didn't live in the 1950s, nor will I make such a claim. And this is the first of many disclaimers I will place in this video series. So why am I uploading this video series? It's because of a video that was uploaded by a musical group known as Pentatonics. Specifically, I will be referring to a music video they uploaded to YouTube, which was entitled Evolution of Music. Okay, I'm now going to place a hyperlink in the description below so you can actually watch this video and see what I'm discussing here. Okay, let's go on. So is there any problems with this video? Well, there's certainly no problem with the musical group Pentatonics. There's no problem with them whatsoever. They are a very talented musical group, no question about it. And the selection of songs that they made, there was no problem with that either. A lot of those songs I actually remember. So there's no problem with their selection of music. After all, they are covering songs here, so there's really no selection. There's no problem with their selection. See what I mean? So what is the problem? Well, the problem starts with the title of their music video, Evolution of Music. That's the first problem. The second problem you won't notice until you start watching the upper right corner of the screen. What they are doing is they're trying to represent the various decades from 1910 to so on and so forth. They say, well, they represented the 11th century too. Well, yeah, they did. But their message was that what they were singing was an accurate representation of each and every successive decade. Now, I made mention of this on Facebook, and I'll explain that in just a second. But the thing was that was the whole content of their video, was to try to accurately represent the various decades. Now, I know about the little disclaimer they placed at the end of their video. Really? At the end of the video? I've already placed one disclaimer at the beginning of mine. So you don't have these high expectations that I actually remember from that decade about the music, because I didn't live in the 1950s. I placed that disclaimer at the beginning of the video to make sure people watched it and didn't make false claims about me. No, they knew specifically that they were going to tick off a lot of people when they made this video. They knew that. That's why they put the quick disclaimer at the end of the video, because they knew they were going to tick people off. And they certainly did. They ticked me off really, really big time. See what I mean? And they knew exactly what they were doing. So give me this. They didn't know. Yes, they did know. There's no innocence here. They knew what they were going to do was going to tick off a whole bunch of people, and that's why they put that quick disclaimer at the end. Well, how many of these young adults are going to watch that disclaimer at the end? Probably not a lot. They're only going to watch the singing. Oh, let's admire the singing. Let's admire the singing. They say, well, where did you get all this aggravation from? Okay. Now, here's the thing. The reason this video went viral is because a group known as the Caspars Delectus Photography, and I probably didn't pronounce that right, but this group has placed that video on their Facebook page and has distributed it all over Facebook, so the thing has gone viral. If it had been some little 2-bit video that had left on YouTube and nobody even really noticed it, again, I probably wouldn't say anything. But this thing's gone viral. And it is not an accurate representation of the 50s, the 60s, or the 70s. And that's what I'm ticked off about. I'm not ticked off at the choice of music. I'm not ticked off at the group itself. They did a very good job of singing these songs. I'm ticked off at their deliberate attempt to try to represent the various decades in their video. Oh, let's put a quick disclaimer at the end so we won't get people ticked off. We're already ticked off. I was ticked off the very second I saw it. So, because of that, that's why I'm making this video series. I am going to more accurately represent the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s in this video series. Now then, you say, well, you didn't even live in the 1950s. How are you going to do that? Alright, I'll show you that in a little bit. But let's go on here. So how am I going to do this? Well, the first thing I'm going to do is to get you people to think about what a song actually is. What is it? Well, a song is poetry set to music. Okay? Now, who reads poetry? Who even remembers a poem? Who can accurately define what a poem actually is? I'm going to leave that to my viewing audience. If you got a good definition of a poem, leave it right there in the comments below. I'd love to see your definitions. And I will not talk about the definition of poetry until I see what you guys think of poetry. I want to see your definition of poetry before I make mine. I'd like to see that. And I may base my definition of poetry on what you say. Of course, I'll do some research as well, but I will base a lot of what my definition of poetry is on what you say. I'd like to see that. Now, why would poets set their poetry to music? Because it was a good way to get people to remember their poems. They had a message that they wanted to send to future generations, and they knew by setting it to music that they would send that message to future generations. I mean, gee, if your poem is set to a catchy tune and that catchy tune is catchy enough, people are going to remember what you had to say. That's why they do that. Hence the song. Okay? So songs really mean something. They have a message. You just got to figure out what it is. Some songs are political messages. Other songs are messages of love or of sadness or of joy. Doesn't matter. The point is there's a message in that song. And that's the poetry part of the song. See what I mean? And that's what music's all about. And there were messages in just about every single song that was written and performed between the 1950s and the 1980s. You say, well, there's messages in songs of the 90s and the 21st century. But those messages aren't as clear as they were back in those decades. And I will prove that. 100%, I will prove that. And besides, I will also prove that the songs between the 50s and the 80s were far more memorable than the ones that went on from the 90s on forward. And I will prove that as well. So, what was life like back in the 1950s? Because it was the way people lived at that time that inspired so many of these songs. See what I mean? The way you lived back then is what got you to the point where you were relating to the songs. I think you're seeing my point at this point. If you're not, you can go ahead and tell me that you're not seeing it, because I will cover this further in depth in my next video. I promise you that. So what was life in the 1950s? Well, I'm going to start with 1950, and I'm not going to start it in this video. I'm going to start it in the next one. And I'm going to tell you what life was like back then. And where am I going to get my sources? I'm going to list my sources in the comments below. Not in this particular video, but from this point forward, I'm going to list my sources down here in the comments below so you can know. I have relatives have lived through the 1950s. I have friends who have lived through the 1950s. And more importantly, I'm going to cite very specific sources of very specific experts, like citing references of Dick Clark and Wolfman Jack. And, of course, when I start in the 1970s, I'll start referring to Casey Kasem. But the most important source I'm going to use is Billboard magazine. Okay? And let me tell you something. I'm not like Jeff Bliss. Okay? Whatever I cite is going to be right down here. You can look it up for yourself. And I'm going to cite source after source after source. And you're going to get a real picture of what the 1950s, the 1960s, and the 1970s were all about. Now, why am I not going to cover the 1980s? Well, because the way I personally feel, because I did actually live during that time period, music pretty much after 1983 was kind of going downhill. It hadn't fallen completely yet, but it was starting to go downhill, and there wasn't as many memorable songs from the 1980s as there were from the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. Let me tell you something. If you mention specific song titles, you can say, well, those came from the 1950s. Or you can say, these songs came from the 1960s. Or you can say, these songs came from the 1970s. And I'm going to prove this. Okay, there were specific genres related to those decades, and for specific reasons. You have a much harder time with the 1980s, and that's why I'm not going to cover it. Now, if you guys want to cover it, that's fine with me. I don't care. But I'm not going to cover the 1980s. Because like I said, music was starting to go downhill at that point, as far as I'm concerned. Now, I know some people say, oh, music was great. As soon as you realize what I'm talking about, when I'm talking about the 50s through the 70s, you begin to really understand and comprehend what I was talking about in the line of music starting to fall apart in the 1980s. Right now, if you mention certain song titles, I couldn't tell you whether they came from the year 2000 or from the year 2010. I couldn't tell you that. Because there really wasn't anything in the 21st century that was so distinctive that you could say, well, that came from that year. There's no distinctive genre in the 21st century. At least not that I've ever found. But in ages past, there were. And I'm going to clearly illustrate this. All right. Anyway, I'm going to continue this in my next video, and I'm sure you're going to be very fascinated about what I tell you. It's going to really stun you. I will tell you more in a future video, so I want you to stay tuned.